Hello, my name is Revis Turner. I'm one of the directors of Because Kids Grieve. We are located in Twin Falls, Idaho, and we have a Because Kids Grieve Grief Center where we have a lot of our activities that take place for our children and our families. I've been with Because Kids Grieve since 2007. It was formed as a nonprofit to support children and families in the Magic Valley area to begin with. During this time, we've grown to include all of southern Idaho. We have operations in the Treasure Valley and in eastern Idaho, Idaho Falls and Pocatello and in the region. We have leaders trained in each of the areas to lead groups to deal with children and grief and families as well. We mainly have evening grief groups for children and Saturday day camps during the year, and then a 3-day camp experience in the campgrounds in Cascade. Wonderful experiences for the children. The purpose is to support the families of children and in their grief experience to deal with that. Death is a very natural part of life. No one escapes it. We can't avoid it. The journey is a reality that ultimately brings us together as human beings. We can't avoid it, yet many have difficulty bringing it into one's consciousness. We try to avoid it. Death and grieving is a very painful experience, and it's difficult to understand. When we turn our attention to children in particular, as they focus on it, bereaved children often feel like they're the only ones who are dealing with it, with the death of someone in their lives. Almost every child who has come through Because Grieve Center doors has stated something to the effect that they thought they were the only one in their school or class or team or group who has lost a significant person in their lives through death. They feel isolated. Well, this short video presentation is provided for any person who wants to develop a framework for understanding grief in children for the purpose of becoming a trained mentor and leader in Because Kids Grieve program. We believe all children should have access to supportive, compassionate adults in their lives. Often this can be one of the darkest times in a person's life, and we want to offer a safe place to pick up the pieces and learn to live in the middle of grief and loss. To begin our first session, we want to start with a framework for understanding grief in children. Let's define grief first. Grief is a natural response to loss and a personal experience best understood from the perspective of the bereaved person. This means when we consider the experience of a child, the need to find a common language or terminology that addresses the unique grief experiences of a child can be challenging. In doing so, we then can provide a way to understand the impact of grief on the life of a child. The Harvard Child Bereavement Study, co-directed by J.W. Warden, interviewed and tested 125 children between the ages of 6 and 17 and their families over a 2-year period of time. Of these children, 74% lost a father and 26% lost a mother. Warden concluded that there were 4 distinguishing tasks of mourning for these children. Number 1 was accepting the reality of loss. And secondly, the experience of pain or emotional aspects of loss. And third, the adjustment of an environment in which the deceased is missing. And number four, relocating the person within one's life and finding ways to memorialize this person. This research in the 90s marked a shift in thinking about grief in past years as a process of detachment to a process of a transition into life becoming a new normal. In this understanding of transition, the grieving child adapts to the changes brought about by the reality of death and continues in this transition to a meaningful connection with the deceased person through thoughts, internal conversations, memories, and legacy-honoring activities. Warden's work has led to a current practice to the use of a developmental model to look at grief as a natural process to transition from the significant loss of a loved one from life before to embrace one's life after the death of a significant person. Let's imagine we have an inflated beach ball and give it to an infant. And when we give it to the infant, they'll interact with it and based on previous experience, they'll touch it, they maybe try to grab it and maybe try to bite it, but this is so large that they figure out maybe some other way to interact it. They may push it, or when they get a little bit older, begin to bounce it on the floor, and they find a way to adapt that into their life. And then imagine, if you will, that the beach ball is the death of a person close to the child. And her struggle with the beach ball is her struggle with adopting to the reality of someone in her life who has died. It's also a struggle to more fully understand what this death means to her life and how to adapt it to the world in which this person is no longer physically present. It's additionally a struggle to understand how the world works and to figure out the ability to successfully navigate the changes brought about by death. And when you take the beach ball and imagine what the child is going through and trying to adapt and make the transition with the death of the loved one. Maybe this child might cry at night, or they enjoy playing, or my favorite book is, or I still hurt when I think of my loved one I have lost, or I cry at night, or I have a hard time expressing my emotions. I get angry for no reason. So these are what the child is trying to adapt to and making sense out of this. So it's a struggle how to understand how the world works and make new sense out of that, to make that transition. Think back to your childhood. How would you understand or react to the death of a loved one, someone significant to you? Often the immediate natural life experience would be to struggle with the crisis or the task of facing ideals or how one believes the world is supposed to work with a new reality of how it really does work. A child has in his mind the ideal of grieving and then has to face how it really works. For example, Spies and Bart identified 3 realities about the death which a younger child struggles, and they wrote this book in 1994. First, that death is irreversible. That's something new for a young child. What then? That when a person dies, his or her bodily functions also cease. The person who dies, the bodily functions cease. And that person who is dead cannot communicate with them. And that's how it really works. This is the reason, because Kids Grieve has found a place in southern Idaho to support children who arrive at these understandings in ways that are helpful, not harmful. Consider this question. How do children understand death? Experts suggest that the understanding of death involves comprehending the concepts of irreversibility, finality, inevitability, and causality. Well, these are big words for a child, but what this means is that most children before the age of 5 do not realize that all people, including themselves, die. By the ages of 9 and 10, most children have developed an understanding of death as final, irreversible, and escapable. Let's look at this next question. How do children react to the death of a loved one? The Harvard study cited at the beginning of this session stated that children reacted with sadness and tears to the news of the death of their loved one. In most cases, the crying subsided or lessened over time. Although 13% of the children cried daily or weekly, even after a year, tears were often triggered by the sight of other crying or memories that occurred to them of their loved one. Bereaved children also became anxious over the safety of other loved ones or themselves. And many children in this study expressed guilt or remembered misbehavior or missed opportunities to express affection. At times, outbursts of anger and acting out behavior, somatic complaints, and other displays of physical harm increased during the first year. It's been our observation that because Kids Grieve, that over several years of observing behavior of children and teens attending our camps and other events, we've witnessed many of the behavioral traits described by this research that we've been talking about. Quite often, children, when they initially registered for an activity, display anxious moments. Sometimes parents reassuring that this is a good activity and to give it a chance. I recall less than 5 students in the time that I've been a part of Because Kids Grieve who have decided not to stay with the group. And that's out of over 1,000 children who have participated. It is because I see the initial contact the child and the mentor is in welcoming the children to the group. Helping the child feel welcome is the most important thing we do at the beginning. It sets the stage for almost everything else that goes on. As a mentor, you will often have a registration information about the children, and after introductions, you will have some pre-camp activities to engage with your camper. Come prepared with get acquainted questions. Their grade, their school, what are the favorite things they like to do, toys, animals. Ask them about the animals' names. The beginning of the event helps them feel safe. There's research by an Andy McNeil and a Pamela Gabay who have recognized 5 universal realities of grief. They summarize their research with these thoughts. Childhood grief is an individual journey. We may all be on the same journey, yet there are many paths. We should be cautious about making too many assumptions of what each person's journey is like. And understanding this lays the foundation for mentors to be welcoming, providing a connection to bolster the supportive relationship. The first universal reality they describe is grief is personal. It belongs to the person who is grieving. There is no right or wrong way to grieve, and it is important to give the child room to grieve in the way that feels most comfortable and natural to them. We bring into the journey our personalities, our preferences, our cultural context, and beliefs from the family. This means we as mentors do not force the help or support into their grief path. However, the way we do it is to enter their journey as learners and travel with them as we are invited to do so by the child. For example, two male cousins at a summer camp were referred to because kids grieve by a Department of Health and Welfare social worker who had not been able to get the boys to talk with her about the person in their lives who had died in a very traumatic event. After being introduced to the boys, who they kept to themselves in the first day and initiated little conversation in the cabin group. After the next day of being together, playing games, being in the group activities and discussions, and gathering in the evening in the cabin, they began to describe the traumatic event with the cabin buddies and expressing the feelings that they experienced in the death of their father. They were able to trust the cabin buddies and feel safe telling their story in more detail for the first time. The key was being patient with these boys and listening to their story as it unfolded in a way that led to a good camp experience. So grief is personal. Secondly, universal reality is grief is transitional. This transition is a personal one as one adapts to their understanding of the world and how it works and their place in it. As the families restructure, regroup, and adapt to the absence of one of their members, people in transition from the way things were to the way things are now that the person has died, the process continues through the children's lives. There is no specific timeline for grief. Children will continue to grieve and regrieve, particularly as they reach important milestones in their lives. Think about a high school prom, or a driver's license, or a graduation, or a college, or a job, a career, marriage. These important transitions in their lives, children will regrieve this experience. The purpose is not to find a remedy for grief, but to explore the changes that grief is bringing to the reality. Dr. Alan Wolfelt, a noted author on bereavement, encourages people in the grieving process to make grief your friend. This may be surprising to many of us, but making grief your friend is part of the transition that we experience as we move through the different parts of our lives. The third universal reality Gabay and McNeil discovered was grief is both seen and unseen. So recognizing this reality has implications on how we interact with children. Children who outwardly display grief often get the attention and concern of the mentor, whereas those who are more reserved and less outwardly responsive might not get the same level of attention. It is easy to assume that children are okay if they are not showing a lot of outward signs. Even so, children who are not showing outward signs of grieving may be considered by adults to be bottling it up inside. Grief is not a simple experience to express at once. get it out, and move on. Children often lack the language to express the emotions or behaviors, and this becomes a challenge. It's difficult to express what's going on internally. Mentors should avoid the assumption that if a child is not talking about the person who has died, there is little need for support. Instead, it's important to create an environment that is comfortable for children that reflects empathy, care, and support. Members should avoid assuming whether or not someone is grieving based on the outward expressions of grief, because children, like their adults, sometimes internalize all of the feelings, and it takes a significant time to get those feelings out. Universal reality number 4 is grief is a shared experience. Grief does not happen in a vacuum, but it happens in a context and culture, a family, a community. They help a child understand his world and how they grieve and cope with that reality. One study mentioned the relationship with the surviving caregiver as a top indicator of the health of bereaved children, as how well they do after the death. One of the key elements of the Because Kids Grieve program is the inclusion of the parents and guardians in the support group session along with the kids. Our Kids to Kids monthly group meetings, as well as the Saturday day camps, include groups for adults in which a time for the kids and adults come together as well to report to each other what their experience has been like during the event. To end the session, we often go around a circle for the kids and adults to tell what was meaningful to you that day. One parent shared that it has been a long time her daughter has had a smile on her face, let alone shown any laughter. The mother said, "Today is the first time in a while that I am so happy to see my child smile and laugh again." Mentors should find ways to incorporate and include the parents and guardians in the support setting. Universal reality number 5 is grief is integral. We mean grief is an integral part of how a person incorporates the loss into his or her present reality. Grief is a process in which a person struggles with the reality in which he or she may not have a context of how the world works. As illustrated before, the beach ball, the death of someone significant in their lives, in which a child struggles with how to adapt the experience of death into her present reality, to figure out how the world works in this new light, who she is becoming, how she needs to change her identity, and what she will be as a result of this event. She may be a sister. A sibling gone may not be a sister anymore. She has to change a new identity. She may have a parent that's missing who has died, and she may not have a parent anymore. And so it's changing a new identity. Our job is not to take the grief away, but to provide a safe place in which she can grieve. And in this way, we support children to make grief a friend, to not fear it, but to transform our life from negative emotions and look to a positive journey on the path to healing and health. These 5 universal realities of grief provide a context to understand and support children. So how do we apply this? Grief belongs to the griever. Grief is itself healthy. Grief is integral for children to make the transition to a new understanding of how the world works. Grief makes it okay that people in our lives die, and at the same time, we can be okay and continue to live and thrive. In that way, grief is your friend in your journey to growth and health. And grief happens when we receive love, and often the more we love, the more we grieve. Thank you for participating in the first session of this training on the framework for understanding grief in children.